Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for another project. Now over the last few years I couldn't help but notice that Gunne Sax dresses have become exceedingly popular. Now of course I am exceptionally late to this as a trend. I do believe that cottagecore probably had its peak back in like 2021, 2022, and these sort of prairie style dresses from the 1970s certainly fall into that genre of fashion. And while personally I'm much more of a not a cottage in a field, more like a mausoleum in the woods kind of a gal, I still think that a lot of the styles can be transferable between the two just by choosing different fabrics. And of course, you could go ahead and make up this dress in a Liberty cotton or something very lightweight. All in white would be extremely both Edwardian and apropos for either a Gunne Sax or a more Laura Ashley sort of look. But naturally, instead of something light and frothy, I'm going to be going with all black. So yes, once again, I'm going to be making a more gothic version of this, but that's only down to the textile, and you could of course use whatever you want and these same modifications to create a much more authentic Gunne Sax style. Now making this dress and replicating this pattern is actually a very good project for those of you who are newer to pattern drafting or have been doing it a while, because it takes a lot of the elements that you need to learn and puts them all into one design. So I'll be going over princess seams, how to add a yoke front and back, how to add gathering to a A-line skirt, how to make the ruffles to go on that, which is actually more of a sewing thing. I don't like to make ruffle patterns. If something is just a rectangle, I just write down what size rectangle I need, but we'll get to that as we dive into this project, which with all of these elements is on the larger side. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Now I do have my sketch beside me so I can reference that as I work. And this was based on a particular style of Gunne Sax I saw floating around over on Etsy and eBay and Pinterest, of course, so I'll have all those links for you in the description below. But I begin with my basic bodice block as per usual, that's right. I'm going to go ahead and trace a copy of the front of that, including all relevant information, the apex, the darts. Now I was studying the yoke on this actual Gunne Sax design quite closely because I was trying to determine if it went into the shoulder seam or down into the arm side itself. The ruffle covers this, so I can't really tell just by looking at the garments on a mannequin or on a person. But to achieve the exact angle of this pointed yoke that I am after, I think I'm going to have to dip it into the arm side. And you will see me draw this yoke in a couple of times as I try and work my way around exactly where this line needs to be. And again, looking at this design, the ruffle does kind of cloud your judgment on where this line needs to be because the ruffle makes this line, like visually lowers this. And so you have to keep in mind where the yoke seam needs to be and where the ruffle needs to be. And because I'm having this dip into the arm side, I will not be able to sew the ruffle in this yoke seam. I will apply it on later, almost like a trim. So you'll see that at the very end of this video today as well. Now, something I have noticed as I've begun studying Gunne Sax dresses and designs here is that they nearly always use a princess seam. I don't think I've seen any of the Gunne Sax dresses use actual darts. Often it seems these have the seam going up into the arm side. That can be a little bit curvy and trickier to sew, so since this piece is going to have that area underneath the ruffle anyhow, I'm just going to have my princess seam go up towards the neckline, as I personally find the neckline princess seam the easiest to sew. But once I have finally decided on the shape of my yoke, sorry about the mess of marker here, I will again draw in my princess seam line. You will shortly see how I use this princess seam to fit the bodice as opposed to these darts, which will be closed up and essentially thrown away. But I will go ahead and start cutting this out so I can start doing some basic pattern manipulation here for these first few pieces. I will separate the bodice from the yoke itself here, from the neckline yoke, I suppose. And of course I will draw in one more line because I still was not satisfied, honestly. This ended up being about an inch up from the level of the apex and about an inch down into the shoulder seam, just so you can get your bearings. That's what I ended up with in the end. Of course, there's lots of marker on the front of this and it's now a mess, but that's the nature of deciding what you're doing on the fly. I didn't make a mock-up before this. I'm doing everything live with you, and by live I mean last week. But of course, now that I've cut the yoke and the bodice apart, I will need to add seam allowance to each piece so that they can be sewn back together later. So I'll add a 1/2 inch on. Again, some people do not add seam allowance to their patterns, but I do because I don't trust myself and I know I will forget. That's right. All right, just tape down my floops here so that that seam allowance doesn't get caught on anything, now that my paper pattern has all these extra flappies going on. All right, so we've separated the yoke. This is going to be the front yoke, Gunne Sax Dress 2026, and this is going to be my front pattern piece. Of course, we still need to go ahead and do that princess seam here, so I'm going to cut this apart, cut down to the apex, separate that front bit, and I will cut away this dart. Goodbye, we no longer need it. All of that fullness will be absorbed into the seam itself. And I can also pinch away this dart over here, fold that closed, and now all of the dart fullness has been absorbed into this front princess seam. While the yoke seam for the neckline at the top of the bodice here is just there for style reasons, this seam is both here for style and fit reasons. It is maintaining the fit of my bodice. And once again, I will need to add seam allowance to each side of this so that it can be sewn back together later. I do take a tiny bit of smoothing right over the tip of the bust so that this is not quite as pointy when I'm wearing it later. You can take more off and then ease this piece in. I leave my princess seams quite pointed overall compared to, say, maybe a modern commercial pattern because I know I will be wearing a more vintage style brassiere underneath. I wear the Bali brand flower bra, which is a much more 1940s shape of brassiere, and therefore a pointier bust in my pattern is not only a good thing, it's necessary for things to fit properly in the end. Now, of course, I need to dip down the center front of this, so it's a slightly more princessy. I'm going to go ahead and tape on some extra paper and just point the front of the bodice here. This doesn't change anything on the side front, but the very center front will be pointed down like so. You can add as much of a point or as little as you would like, or none at all, actually. All right, so we have my bodice front. I now need to start working on the bodice back, which does also have a yoke, but instead of a pointed yoke, it has a rounded yoke. So we'll make sure to include that. I always say with something like a yoke, you can draw in any shape you want as long as you're willing to sew it. Because, of course, if you draw in like a very scalloped or swoopy yoke, you're going to have a real fun time sewing it later. But that's the sewer's problem down the line, not the pattern drafting problem, right? Unless, like in our case, that happens to be the same person. So do try not to torture future you too much when drawing things in. Now I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my yoke crosses through the very point of my back shoulder dart here so that I can close that dart up and still have everything fit nice and smooth along my back. So this dart will get closed up into the fit line, I guess, of the upper back. So in this case, while on the front, the yoke seam did not add any fit in the back here, I am using the yoke not only as a seam line intended to add style, but also in order to control fit. Seam lines can always be used for either purpose, so when you're replicating a design, it's important to study closely to see if they may have hidden fit in a style line, or if there may be no fit involved at all. Just there visually for color blocking or other stylistic reasons, I suppose. But I will mark my grain line on these pieces as well, and I have again extended my back dart up into the yoke seam so that I can use that as a princess seam as well. For the back, again, that controls the fit fullness from this back waist dart. But now I can cut everything out, cut everything apart, close up those darts, and add seam allowance to these pieces so that, again, they can be sewn back together later on. Now, of course, again, if you're using like a striped fabric and you wanted to switch up the grain line on these pieces to create chevroning, that could be quite fun, but you could also do both color blocking or texture blocking with something like this. Do the yokes in a sheer fabric and the bodice itself in something solid. You can really get creative with the mixing and matching when it comes to a dress like this. I often see on actual Gunne Sax that they will put the center pieces, especially in the front, as like a black velvet or something like that, and then have prints along the side pieces. So you might want to change up your center front, or in this particular style, the yoke. I know I will be lining the bodice, but not the yoke, so that the eyelet maintains its transparency over my chest and the upper back. And when using an eyelet or lace fabric, you can, of course, line it in a contrasting color. So I will be using a black cotton eyelet fabric today, which has little holes in the embroidery. And if I had lined this in, say, yellow or red or green, that would shine through the slightly sheer areas of this fabric. I, of course, went with black on black, as I previously mentioned, for all parts of this dress. Everything will be in black cotton today. Which does mean, because I have the ISO turned up so high so you can see what I'm doing in parts of this video, in order to see the details between pieces, some clips of this video are going to be a little on the grainy or noisy side just because the camera is trying its best to capture the detail in the dark. Alright, back pattern all in order. I'll set these pieces aside for now and we can start working on the sleeve. I'm going to trace a copy of my basic sleeve block here. Mark that front and back. I'm going to go ahead and add width to this. You could really just straighten the sides of this off, which is how I'm going to start, and then add some width through the center of this sleeve. But I decided to get a little tricky and go ahead and do a puff modification to the top of this at the sleeve cap, and then flare the sleeve a bit additionally afterwards. So you'll see me go through that process here. And I do have a video all about the principles behind adding puff to sleeves, so I can link that in a card here as well. But I'll begin by indicating 2 inches out from either side of the center along the sleeve cap here. Then I will connect those indications down to the center of the bicep line here along the sleeve. I can go ahead and cut down those lines into that central area, and then I will hinge out to the underarm seam so that I can swing my sleeve cap up and out. That way I can add fullness not only over the bicep area in the center of the sleeve itself, but up here into the sleeve cap. So I can add puff and gathering along this area with this style. How high you raise this from the baseline there is up to you, how much puff you want to add. I'm going to raise this center area. It's kind of adding in a crescent that's about 1.25 inches wide here at the central point. And then I will add a little bit more volume to the top of the sleeve cap as well. You don't want to just add gathering and keep it flat. It looks weird. You have to add height as well to the sleeve cap when you're adding puff. Otherwise, you don't get puff so much as you get pucker, and we don't want that. So we'll just ease in another inch up here or so. As you can see, I'm not measuring any of this kind of stuff. I am just eyeballing it. That is years of experience at play, but also just a willingness to wing it, because the difference between a 1/4 inch here and a 1/4 inch there is not very high, and it's still going to fit. Especially when we're adding extra ease. If you didn't add quite as much, you know, you'll know to make your puff bigger in the future. But everything will, of course, still fit at the end if you're adding extra. Now I am going to have sort of a shirt-style cuff at the end of this sleeve, so I need to make my sleeve a tiny bit shorter. I ended up making this about 21 inches long, I think. Honestly, I think I could have kept this full length and just had extra billowiness in my sleeves. My sleeves came out a tiny bit short with this dress. And again, that is down to making things up on the fly. And I am just going to dip the back of my sleeve down a little bit here. It helps give the back of a bishopy sleeve a little bit more billow back here, but also helps you facilitate moving your elbow when you're bending your arms and using them to drive or what have you. So now we have like a kind of a basic straight cut sleeve, but I will expand this just a little bit. Honestly, the Gunne Sax sleeves, this particular style of Gunne Sax sleeve doesn't seem to be that exaggerated, but why not add a little bit of extra fullness in here? Because if you're gonna puff, go hard, you know? So I'm gonna draw lines 3 inches out from the center here, and then I will cut up all the way into the sleeve cap, or the tip of the sleeve cap here, and I will add in a good 3 or 4 inches into each of these splits. You could add more if you want. You can expand this even larger. Just remember to take into account how wide your fabric is later when you go to cut these things out. You may have to put seams in your sleeves if you flare them too far. But I will fill in these splits. I added about a 3-inch split to the front of the sleeve and a 4-inch split here in the back. I'll just smooth that into the hem again, like so. And I will tape down all my floops because now there are a great many floops. So we have a slightly flared and bishoped sleeve, and then a slightly puffed version of a flared bishop sleeve. And of course, all of the bell and flouncy sleeves I went over recently, I can put a card up to that video, would look great on a Gunne Sax dress. But now I need to make a quick cuff pattern here, so I'm just going to take my measuring tape and my wrist and determine a few things. My wrist measurement right below my hand is about 6.5 inches, and then a little bit higher up my arm, it's going to be 7.5 inches. So I'm keeping that in mind as I make a slightly tapered cuff here, which I made 2.5 inches wide. From the center line, I measured outwards half of the distance of my wrist, so 3.25 at the cuff itself, and then at the top of the cuff, I'll make that 3.75. Connect those lines in. I did end up adding an extra 1/8 down here at the wrist, just so that it wasn't too tight and was not annoying while being worn, I suppose. I will need to add 1/2 inch seam allowance to the top and bottom of this, and then I added extra, of course, at the sides because I want this to overlap where I put my buttons and button loops later on. Another 3/4 of an inch on either side, like so. And then I realized, you know, that might be a little bit long. So in the end, I cut off one of the 3/4 of an inch so that it only overlaps 3/4 of an inch, not 3/4 of an inch twice. Hopefully this makes any sense. Play around. You have your wrists handy. You know what I mean? Hold these things up to your body and decide what you would like. So here I'm thinking, I don't need to overlap it that much. I'll take some of that off. There we go. And another additional piece I will need to draft for this design is, of course, the stand collar on this rather Edwardian or late Victorian inspired dress. I will start by teeing off a line to work with, and then I'm going to measure both the front and back necklines of my pattern. So 3 inches for my back neckline and then 4.5 for the front. Then where that front ends along the line, I will come up a 1/2 inch and use my French curve to draw in this front curve for my collar. I will go ahead and make this 1 3/8 high. I would love to have a higher collar, but I don't think that my neck could handle it, sadly. I'm not swan-like enough, unfortunately, myself. I will make the front of the collar a straight line here. Don't need to curve that off or anything because it will be cut along the fold. So the front will be cut along the fold here, but everywhere else I will need 1/2 inch seam allowance, of course, like so. So I will sketch that in. And then I usually use 1 inch of seam allowance along my center back for the zipper, so I'm just going to leave that there for now, and I can cut it down to what I need later on. Better to have too much fabric later on, not enough, because there's no way to, glue it back on there. All right, so that's everything from the waist up done. Now I have to figure out what's going on with the skirt. And I'll begin with a tracing of my A-line skirt pattern. Again, I've shown how I make these here on the channel before, so I can put a card up to that. I've made these pieces 23 inches long, which means that they end just above my knee. Honestly, I needed to make these a little bit shorter, but that's the general zone where I wanted my ruffle to begin. Now, most of the Gunne Sax or Jessica McClintock dresses from the 70s and 80s all have gathered skirts or slight gathering at the waist. So I will need to add additional fullness into these A-line skirt patterns. I am going to draw a line from the waist down to the hem, nearly down the center of the skirt piece really. It's not going to matter too much where you put this. And you could just cut up this line from the hem to the waist and add more flare in here and keep the waist smooth if you want. This is going to be a more circle cut effect. But because I'm trying to add both swish to the hem and also gathering at the waist, I will open this up entirely and add in a wedge of fullness. Now you could add just a straight cut, like a straight rectangle all the way down, but I will of course flare this a little bit so again the hem is still larger than the waistline, even if I am adding a little bit of gathering in. I don't like a highly gathered waist. I don't know, I feel like I have enough going on at my waist without adding fabric in there. I tend to come with padding of my own when it comes to between the waist and the hip area of my body, but that's just me. I'm adding in probably a good 6 inches at the hem here, and probably 3 inches or so up here at the waist. Of course, that will be doubled because this is only half of the front skirt, and will still be cut along the fold. The birds are singing outside. You probably can't hear that between the editing and the music I'll set under this, but many birds are chirping outside. Don't know what's going on there. So all of this needs to be gathered down into the waist of the bodice when I'm sewing, but of course I still have this little dip that I added onto the bodice front. So to account for that, I'm going to draw in my seam allowance and see exactly where that will need to line up, and just sketch in the same dip onto my skirt, and then add seam allowance to that, and cut the tiny little excess triangle away. I'm just going to tape it to my pattern because I might want to use this pattern for a skirt that doesn't have a dip in the future, and then I'll just tape this back in place where it needs to go. I can then go ahead and make the same style of modification to the back, again opening the skirt up and adding in an additional wedge of fullness just to both flare this skirt out a little bit further and create gathering at the waistline. And I don't think I've said, but this dress will have a center back opening, center back zipper to get in and out of it, which does seem pretty common with the Gunne Sax originals. And the only major change I'm going to make from the Gunne Sax dress is I will not have a waist tie on this dress. You could obviously add a waist tie. Just add long ribbons of your fabric and stitch those in along the side seams when you sew those, so you can tie those in the back. I do suspect that some of these Gunne Sax dresses have waist ties to refine the fit for each individual customer. So if you are making something from your block, you will not need those waist ties to snatch the waist because it will already be fitted to you perfectly. Whereas in a commercial garment, it can be good to have an elastic waistline in the back or a tie in the back, something to actually make the dress adjustable towards the individual customer's body. But because my customer is me, I can just make my dress fit perfectly at the waist, and I don't need a tie to help refine that. But of course, if you want the tie, if you want the additional bow going on, you can add that in. But for me, ruffles are enough of a jump outside of my comfort zone. I don't need a bow as well. And here I was just thinking, how big do I want to make this ruffle? But again, I think I cut mine a little too long. Again, I like to err on the side of having to cut more fabric away later as opposed to trying to figure out how to add any back on. But with the skirt pattern finished as well, I can now go ahead and organize my pattern and cut everything out of my fabrics. I am going to cut out nearly everything from some black cotton eyelet. This is sort of a lightweight cotton voile with embroidery on it, but eyelet is sort of strange because the base fabric is usually rather lightweight, but the stitching adds a lot of bulk to it and kind of changes the hand. And I did cut out my main body bodice pieces out of some solid black sheer cotton voile as well, so that I can use those as a bodice lining later on. And I used that same ultra sheer black voile to cut out my long sleeves as well. I did the cuffs in the eyelet, but the sleeve itself I'm going to do in the sheer black cotton. The ruffle on the bodice later I will cut out of the sheer black cotton, and then I did an additional ruffle on top of my skirt ruffle, another layer, like I said, lots of ruffles today, in this sheer black cotton as well. And no, my camera was not in focus at this point. At least of all the points in the process for my camera to lose focus, while I'm cutting out things is a much better place than while I'm trying to show you how I'm drafting a pattern. Now again, I did just cut regular strips along the length of my fabric to use as the ruffle around the bottom hem of this. A good general rule of thumb for ruffling is taking your measurement that you need to attach the ruffle to and multiplying that by 2 to get the amount of rufflage you will need. But because my fabric was about 50 inches wide and my hem was about 50 inches across on the front and back, I needed 4 strips of fabric that I would need to seam together, so I cut off the selvage and I seamed these together using French seams. In fact, I used French seams for quite a lot of this project today. And I had pre-washed and dried both of the fabrics that I used for this dress today, so in the future I can wash this dress, which is always nice for a cotton summer dress. Is this really a summer dress? It's more of an early spring, which of course, what could be more springy than this morning outfit, or really mostly, let's face it, a late summer into fall dress. Despite the fact that this is all cotton, it would still be quite full coverage and therefore warm in the summertime. Better in a dry heat, it would keep you protected from the sun, but here in New York, if I wore this next month, I think I would just feel entirely sticky, which is not my favorite feeling, and honestly something I tend to avoid as much as possible. Now I'll start working on my actual skirt as well. I'll take the A-line pieces, of course the front was cut on the fold, and I will attach the backs to that. I'm actually going to stitch wrong sides together here first. It's very hard on camera, and honestly not that easy in person to see which side is the right and wrong of this fabric. Usually in an eyelet fabric or an embroidered fabric, one side looks cleaner and nicer than the other, and for this eyelet there were little extra threads hanging off of bits of the embroidery on the back side, so that helped me determine what the heck was going on, but no, it wasn't even easy in person, let alone here after the fact. And again, I am lining these up wrong sides together so that I can stitch them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance over here on the machine, and again, use French seams for the skirt side seams as well. And over here on the machine, I do have a size 12 Microtex needle here in the machine, and I have some black all-purpose Gutermann thread. That's what I'll be using today. And again, I am switching up my seam allowance here at the stitching station, because normally I'm stitching with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and technically I still am. I just have to sew things twice at a 1/4 inch to equal that 1/2 inch of extra, and I will have to trim these down, iron them in place again, and then sew them again. I always say French seams feel like twice the work, and that's because they are. So here I am trimming that seam allowance down. I will press this to give myself a good starting point to go ahead and repin everything, and then stitch it all again, this time with right sides together. That way the last of the encased seam allowance is on the inside, but of course all raw edges will be contained within the French seam. As if I have to explain French seams to you. You are all probably far more patient than I am and use them all the time. Me, I have to be convinced. I definitely think I could have just serged all of this, by the way. Usually that's what I do to encase my raw edges. And I did serge the hem of this skirt piece later on, but that was actually the only piece I used the serger on today. Because I was going to line the bodice and like most of this was going to be finished nicely on the inside, I decided to be good and use some French seaming. And I kind of wanted this to be almost an heirloom quality dress. We're not quite there because, again, I'm just not patient enough. But because this is a, in my opinion, very timeless dress, I thought it would be good to use some sturdier techniques on this in case someone else wants to wear this after me. And don't you worry, all pieces of my dress were currently in inspections, going through customs, as it were, and getting their requisite layer of fur attached. In this case, luckily, Sophia was on the job, which is better for a black project, honestly, because most of her fur is darkest brown or black. Not all of it, but most. Though Oliver is set to clock in later, so we'll see how it goes. And I set my very long ribbon, a 200-inch long rectangle that I would have to hem the top and bottom of for my ruffle. I set that aside because I didn't exactly want to do that just yet. Set the rest of the skirt aside as well and started working on my sleeves. Again, I cut these out of a very sheer black cotton voile, and I will again use French seams for this as well, because when it comes to sheer fabrics, it's always a good idea to use French seams. That way everything looks nice when you can see through the fabric. Hopefully that makes sense. And I will also use some of the cutoffs from seaming my ruffle bits together to create small little tubes that I will cut the seam allowance down on and then turn right side out. And I will use these tubes later for making button loops as I start sewing the cuffs, etc. I will use button loops for the cuffs and also for the back of my collar later on. But back to French seaming. Luckily with this fabric there is no right and wrong side, they're both the same. So that's in some ways useful and in some ways confusing. And this is a sheer cotton from Fabric Wholesale Direct, I believe, and it's very, very lightweight, so just keep that in mind, but it is very consistent and nice, and it does come in many colors, so I can link this fabric for you below. The black eyelet, on the other hand, has been in my stash for years. I think I still have another 2 yards of this perhaps left. I bought a bunch of it because it was on sale once on fabric.com, which of course no longer exists because it was absorbed into Amazon, sadly. So I did grab a ton of this a long time ago, and it has been languishing forgotten, so it's good to have finally put it to use. And as predicted, the tabby boy has shown up to get his fur on everything as well. Thank goodness. Again, trimming my seam allowances down to 1/8 of an inch, turning everything the other direction and pressing the seam again, pinning that into place just so things don't shift around on me before I sit back down at the machine and sew the French seam for a second time. And while my order of operations today was mostly motivated by procrastinating certain bits that I didn't want to do in that very moment, I'll note that it was technically a mistake to sew this underarm seam first on my sleeves. I should have done the sleeve plackets first while everything was still flat. And this made things a little bit more annoying in a moment here. Still perfectly possible, but you really don't want to make sleeve placketing any more irritating than it already is gonna be. But anyhow, I will start constructing my sleeve cuffs instead here. So I have the eyelet layer, and then again I will line that with the plain voile. Just want to do 3 little loops on here, so I was trying to figure out how long I needed to make these. And this little like 1/8 of an inch tubing I created was made on the straight grain. I'm not sure if you're supposed to use bias cut fabric to make button loops. Maybe? I guess it would be a bit stretchier, but maybe that's a bad thing. I don't do a ton of button loops. I've probably used button loops like under a dozen times in all my years of sewing. So do forgive me if this is not official procedure. But I had my little plastic buttons sitting nearby so that I could test things out. Basically I need like 1/2 inch or slightly less of a loop here. So I'm making these a little bit longer, of course, so that the tails can be caught within the seam allowance of my cuff. And I'll pin those into place facing inward. That way when I turn this right side out, they pop out along the seam. I'm going to do 1 on either end here, just within the seam allowance, and then I'll center a 1/3 between them. The nice thing about being someone who sews with black most of the time is that I always have black thread, zippers, buttons, accoutrement in stock because I know I'm going to need it. So I just went through my drawer of buttons and found something that would work. Luckily I had, I think, 8 or 9 of these, which worked out. 3 on each cuff and 2 at the back of the neck. I will then sandwich these loops, which only need to be on this one side, of course, between the lining and the eyelet fabric here. And I will stitch around the 3 outside edges here. Of course, the last needs to be sewn onto the sleeve, so I will leave that open. And I'm working with semi-sheer or sheer fabrics, so I did not interface these pieces in any way because I didn't have any black interfacing. But if you want more structured or crisp cuffs, you could of course interface something like this. And if you did want to keep things sheer, you could do that with something like a silk or polyester organza. Or an all cotton like this, maybe with an organdy, not that I had any in stock, because organdy tends to be on the pricier side, compared to other cottons, that is. And this is when I realized, oh, I should have sewn this shirt plackets on before I sewed this underarm seam. That's going to be a pain in the arse. And it was slightly. I did have to cut some additional rectangles that I used to do this sort of placketing. I will link to the blog post below that I used when learning how to do this, because in all honesty, I still have to go back and look and read through that blog post every time I do this because it's infrequent enough. I only do this once or twice a year, and for some reason that's infrequent enough for me to have not committed the process to memory. But that blog post that I found when Googling frantically several years ago has proven a very reliable resource, so again, you can find that link in the description below. Not Spawn. No idea. I have never read anything else on that blog. It could be great. It could be terrible. I honestly have no idea. So hopefully I'm not sending you somewhere you shouldn't be. But I've always found that post useful, at least. I have shown how I do these here on the channel before. It's just I'm not very good at explaining it, I fear. And I made these the standard length, and I probably could have made them much shorter for this particular style. But I really do not consider myself an expert in sleeve placketage, sadly enough. So, you know, do as I suggest, not as I do sometimes. And because of all my French seaming and making little loops and doing all the fiddly sleeve stuff, all I managed to do this day was cut everything out and then make the sleeves, and then I had to call it quits. This was a good 3 full day project for me. Though that does include moving the camera around and setting up the shot all the time, and of course being interrupted by cats, so I'm not saying it couldn't have been done faster. But I've clipped my corners and turned my cuffs right side out, giving those a nice press, and I will finish up these plackets, which, again, in all black too. It's like, oh, good luck to me. A lot of this is actually quite grainy today. And usually when I'm doing grain here in the studio, it's because I'm like trying to make it look like an old 70s public television program. Today, the grain is just here because I have the ISO turned up so high. And the camera is angry, trying to capture, like my skin and the mint background are getting kind of blown out while I'm trying to capture the black. You would think I would have learned how to light black fabric by now because I'm certainly practiced at it, but it depends on what the sun is doing outside of my windows too. You know, I have film on my windows down in the sewing parlor, partially for privacy and partially just to diffuse sunlight because you never know what the sun's doing. Sometimes it means I have to change camera settings from like minute to minute down here, which is why I often find myself filming things after dark. That way I can at least control the lighting entirely. And right or wrong, it'll be entirely my fault, and I can't blame anything on nature. But I did finally manage to wrangle my sleeve placketing into order, and then I put 2 lines of gathering stitching, just using the largest stitch length on my machine, 2 lines parallel around the bottom of my sleeve, so that I can gather it all down and fit them into my cuff. And all the seam allowance will be encased in the lining of the cuff. And of course, in an actual Gunne Sax, this is often where they slip in more lace trimmings along the cuff and into these seams. I only had so much all cotton lace sitting around. I really like Venetian lace, or like what it's called, Venetian lace. It's not actually made in Venice anymore, I guarantee that. But it is so often made of polyester, and just the subtle shine of it, I can tell. So I try and only use like cotton, crochet, or Cluny lace on all cotton projects like this, just because that's how persnickety I am. And that's why I was reluctant to use some of the trims that I do have around, but I just didn't want to use them on this particular project. Try and keep things that are all natural fibers, because it is so rare here in my studio. I do love a polyester, mostly because that's what they use to make funky, textured, and metallic brocades. And of course I shouldn't be using petroleum-based materials, but they have not invented highly metallic linen yet, so hopefully they will, I don't know. When you see a metallic linen, it's either some sort of a laminated finish or a blend with Lurex, so if they ever figure out how to grow a plant that does that naturally, with like, I don't know, mica-infused fibers, that would be very exciting. But with my gathering stitch into place, I can turn the inside in on itself, the seam allowance in on itself, I suppose, that 1/2 inch, pin this into place. You could hand stitch this into place, but I am just going to do a fine edge stitching along the outside of my cuff that will catch this and hold it right where I want it. You could add some decorative top stitching at this point as well, especially if you have one of those modern machines that does all those fancy stitches. You could choose one that looks almost like lace in itself. Now I just need to put this onto my arm and decide where my buttons need to go so that my cuff fits as I would like. And I will stitch those on, and look, we have a sleeve cuff. I may not have much else going on for this dress just yet, but after a full day of work I had functioning sleeves, which is more than I had when I started the day, I guess. But I was very excited to start working on the actual bodice next. And because this area will be lined, I'm just going to use regular seaming as opposed to French seams. So I am just lining up the back princess seam here, the side back and the center back pieces. And I'll press open my center front piece as well because I was able to cut this on the fold. I cut the front yoke on the fold as well. And after giving things a little cursory press, I went ahead and lined up the front princess seams as well. And as far as fabrics I would reach for this particular design, obviously I've used an eyelet, so I think that is a good choice. Also cotton lawns, poplins, or voile in general. Cotton organdy would be a sheer but much crisper choice as well. A cotton velveteen would be great for wintertime, as would a lighter weight wool flannel perhaps, or even like a suiting weight wool would still be great for a winter version of this dress. And to me the original Gunne Sax version looks like it's like a Liberty print kind of cotton lawn, also sometimes called a ditzy floral print, prints with a high density of small little flowers. And this design in particular does seem to have a contrast yoke. Looks like it might be in a velveteen, with additional lace trim added at the yoke as well, of course. Looks like that might be Venetian lace, or quote-unquote Venetian lace. Again, nothing to do with Venice. Maybe it did once, but not now. Probably somewhere closer to Hong Kong, if I had to guess. Or Shenzhen, maybe. The southern China, if I had to guess. Where a lot of the manufacturing centers are for clothing and shoes as well, and lots of things, really. Don't get me wrong though, I love me some Chinese fabrics, especially the fun textured brocades they make these days. I love picking them up over on Etsy. But with my princess seams stitched, I can go ahead and clip over my curves and press them open and flat. I can then line these up right sides together with each corresponding yoke piece. I like to lay things out flat so I don't get confused and accidentally sew, the right yoke to the left bodice or vice versa. And as you can see, I was receiving a lot of assistance, or perhaps was being challenged by my intern here. Sometimes I just give up and lay down and let him crawl all over me, because I need to let him get it out of his system. And also, he's adorable, but, I am trying to get things done. It's my job to get the sewing project done, buddy. Do you want your fancy cat food or not? These are the questions. Yeah, why don't you sit down? That's an excellent idea, bud. Anyway, back over on the machine, I can sew my yokes to the bodice pieces, like so. These back ones, of course, are easy enough, because there is no center front point where they meet, unlike on the front, where I will have a center point. And in the eyelet, there are, of course, areas of the embroidery that have denser stitching, and I accidentally cut things out so that the very point where the yoke meets the rest of the bodice is right on a thicker medallion of stitches. So I will show you how I stitch that into place in 2 phases in just a moment. But first, I will press all my seam allowance on the back yokes down into the body of the bodice. You could clip this curve. I didn't actually need to in this particular eyelet. And I will go ahead and edge stitch along this seam as well, just to hold that down into place. It'll be covered with the ruffle later on anyhow. I think someone with a loud motorcycle is just doing loops around the neighborhood, and I wish they wouldn't, honestly. And for my front princess seams, I can again clip over the curve of the bust and press the seam allowance open. I do often edge stitch or top stitch along the outside of princess seams along the front to hold all these little tabs in place, but the lining I think on this is going to be sticky enough. Cotton is a staple fiber, which as opposed to slippy slidey like say a polyester, a silk, or a rayon, the fibers kind of grip onto one another, so I don't think it'll move around too much on me. Or at least here's hoping, because if it does, I'll have to one day open this up, take the lining out, and fix it, which I would not like to do, honestly. So I'm taking a chance and betting on cotton. Cotton wouldn't let me down, right? But I will stitch the other front princess seam the same way here. Back over on the machine, half-edge seam allowance for these guys. No French seams this time. I will go ahead and edge stitch or top stitch along the back yokes while I'm sitting here as well. Now I'm going to find the point on both pieces here where the point needs to line up with the inverse point. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm drawing in my seam allowance, making sure I have the exact point where this needs to meet. And I will pin that first, and then I'm going to stitch one side of this, clip things, and then come around and stitch the other side. So I'll pin this side first, stitch that into place, making sure I'm starting and stopping exactly where I need to at the point. And then once that is sewn, I'll come back over here and just put a clip right here where this needs to swing to the other side. And this will facilitate my being able to pin this to the other side here. Just be careful. So here's one side of that. Flip this over here. You can do this all in one over at the machine, and that's what I normally do. It's just this fabric was a little textured and funky, and so I decided to do it in phases. Stitch the other side, and now we're looking like this, and I think I got this center point pretty smooth considering that this fabric was not giving me any additional assistance in that regard. I will again press my seam allowance down into the main body of this bodice where it will be covered by a lining later on. I will actually be hand setting in and stitching in my lining as one of the very last steps for this project today, so that's why you haven't seen any lining pieces yet. They're just sitting on the other side of the ironing board waiting for me. And I will, of course, edge/top stitch this as well, just as I did for the back yoke. My goodness, there must be a Harley convention at the next door neighbor's house. What is going on outside? Is it the same person going in circles? Leave us alone. Tell you what, though, by the sound of the motorcycle, they must be super cool. Whatever, I'm boring. It's true. I've never even been on a motorcycle. Never once in my life have I ridden a motorcycle. I've never known anyone who's owned one. But then again, I haven't had many friends for a long time, so that's no surprise. Of course, if there were a slightly mask of center gal with a motorcycle who wanted to randomly enter my life somehow, I wouldn't be mad about it. Happy Pride Month, everybody. Happy Pride. And I can finally stitch my side seams and shoulder seams together for the bodice, stitch the back bodice pieces onto the front. And yes, this is a bit of a longer video today. I probably could have cut this into something shorter, but I wanted to go through this style in particular quite thoroughly because all the techniques I went over during the pattern drafting process and all of this sewing process is applicable to other styles of Gunne Sax dresses. A lot of the other rather specific styles could be made using these same techniques. But if you'd like to see me demonstrate other specific Gunne Sax styles, do let me know and I can certainly do so in the future. I'll even try my best to not use black fabric next time. We'll see. There could be a dark purple out there that I could fall for. There are simply not enough dark jewel tone fabrics out there. Like, there's just not enough forest green. Give me more, like, delicious jewel greens in life. But with my side seams and shoulder seams sewn, I can of course press those open as well. And yes, I am wearing a novelty Halloween t-shirt that my mom bought me today. Thank you for noticing. It is of course covered in cat fur because I'm constantly under attack. In the best way possible. Now, speaking of lace trims, I am going to finally sew some very narrow lace trim onto the edge of a long strip of my cotton voile here. I made this strip for my bodice ruffle 4 inches wide and about 100 inches long overall. Of course, again, depending on your dress, the amount of ruffleage you want, the amount of fabric you have left at this point in the process, your ruffles may vary. But I did a narrow hem on one side of the strip and stitched that lace on over it, and on the other side here I am going to put in 2 lines of gathering stitching, which I had also torn off 4 more strips at about 5 inches wide to make a secondary ruffle to go on top of my wide skirt ruffle here, because I wanted to layer in some of this plain voile on top of the eyelet just to help incorporate this into the bottom half of my dress, because my sleeves are the solid voile, this ruffle at the top is going to be the solid voile. I wanted to incorporate some of this texture into the bottom, or smoother texture, lack of texture, I suppose, which meant I had to hem both sides of another 200-inch strip, so was it the most fun thing I've ever done? No. It turns out part of the reason I don't like ruffles isn't just because I find them too frilly for me, it's because they're fussy to have to sew as well. Now again, my skirt ruffle here was originally 14, though each side has been hemmed, so it's more like 12 now, by 200 inches long. So when I went to go put my gathering stitching in at the machine, I did start and stop my gathering stitching at the seam lines of this very large rectangle so that I didn't have to rely on 2 pieces of thread not breaking for an entire 100-inch long strip. I at least split that in half so that I could have some security going into this process where I had to gather this very large ruffle down onto my skirt. And I have the bottom about 6 inches or so of the center back seam sewn already before I do this. The rest of the back seam on the skirt I will arrange once I have things attached to the bodice and I'm putting in my zipper. But for now, it's all about gathering this ruffle down to fit. Again, because I have 4 lengths of fabric here, I can go ahead and just make sure I have 1 length of fabric in between each of the seams on the skirt as well. So I pinned 1 seam to the center front of my skirt, and then I have about 50 inches to gather down to about 23 inches or so of skirt hem. So I have to gather everything down, but then distribute those gathers evenly along that length. And just so you know, don't worry, the cats are still here observing even this process, assisting in the editing room, as it were. Sophia's on my bed behind me, just kind of watching over my shoulder. I don't know if she's finding this entertaining. She was there for the whole process. It's not like she doesn't already know how this dress went together. I can confirm I turned back around and she does look bored. Don't you? Yes, you do. All right. Oof, let's take this over to the machine. I actually stitched this down section by section as well. I really like to split things into phases, apparently, for this project. So I gathered each quarter of the ruffle down onto the skirt, bit by bit, and I stitched it bit by bit as well. Alright, the skirt ruffle is onto the skirt, and now I can finally attach the skirt to the bodice. So once again, I do have gathering stitching up along the waistline of my skirt. I left the very center point, probably the most central 5 inches or so, smooth and ungathered, and I'm going to use the same 2-step method that I used to sew the pointed yoke onto the bodice to sew the pointed skirt together as well. So I've found where my center point needs to be along the seam line. I'm pinning that together first. I will pin one side of the skirt and gather it down into place, And I will do the other side in that same way. Again, just taking my time to make sure I have things right here at the ironing board and then over on the machine, back and forth until the skirt is attached where I want it. And you can see I was even conserving my black thread at this point because this is a lot of gathering stitching, at least for the ruffle it was. So I had switched over to some dusty pink thread that I'm not likely to ever, run out of or need. It seemed a waste to use so much black thread on gathering stitching that I was just going to pull out in a moment. And while, again, I don't usually make gathered waistline skirts, I actually am really pleased with how this came out, so maybe it's something I'll experiment with more in the future. I don't love a ton of gathering, as I've said, but this was not so bad. Maybe I'll use this skirt pattern to make just a skirt next time. Though, of course, probably still in black. Like a black cotton velveteen skirt in this style would be quite fun. Although, again, a little bit shorter because this came out so long. Don't forget, always at least 2 lines of gathering stitching. Even if you wanted to use 3 lines of gathering stitching, it would make things go a lot smoother when it came to actually distributing your gathers evenly and keeping them from folding and puckering in ways you wouldn't wish. Alright, skirt and bodice are attached. I can go ahead and press my seam allowance again up into the main bodice area where again it will be covered by a lining in the end, or encased, entombed in a lining eventually. And I will go ahead and clip my curves and the point in the front here, just to again facilitate pressing everything where I want it. One of the best things about using cotton is of course how well it responds to the iron. And then I can go ahead and fold back the seam allowance along my center back, where I've left myself an inch as usual. Press that into place, and I will stitch in my zipper using the lapped zipper method that I always use. Again, I do have a video all about how I set in my zippers where it's easier to see what the heck I'm doing, and I explain it hopefully a little bit better than I usually do in my actual project videos, so I can link to that zipper specific video in the description below. I think you could almost get away with wearing this like in the background of 1890 with some, appropriate accessories. But the lack of a corset and proper structure plus this zipper would really break the illusion if you got too close. But now that I have the skirt on and have made this much more unwieldy, what a great time to put my collar on. Probably should have done this before I set the skirt on, but I didn't think of it. So here we are. Silly me, let's finish the top of this. I'm going to go ahead and find the center of my collar and the center of my bodice, pin those together, and I will pin this into place and stitch it on. I did, of course, line this collar as well, which I forgot to mention. Sewed around the outside edges of this, turned it right side out, pressed it into place. Basically, it's the same idea as how I put the cuffs onto the end of the sleeves. Not too dissimilar, I suppose. And again, if you wanted a collar like this to be a bit crisper, you would need to slip in some interfacing or interlining of some kind. Mine's going to be pretty soft today in these 2 fabrics. But I will go ahead and clip my curves, press all my seam allowance up into the collar itself, and then again fold the lining in on itself to cover all of that up. And I will hand stitch this into place. I did fell this into place along the inside. Luckily the black stitches on black fabric disappeared right into the texture of the eyelet, so no one would ever need know that it wasn't done by magic alone. And yes, I should have sewn my button loops into the collar before I seamed it together. That would have been the ideal time to do it. I forgot, so I'm going to have to stitch mine underneath on the collar. So if you turned my collar inside out, you would see the messiness. But don't do that, is the answer to that. Just don't do it. I would never claim to be perfect, because I'm far too much of a perfectionist to ever even imagine I could get close. There's no worries there. And one of my very last steps for this dress today is going to be setting in my sleeves. Again, I have put some gathering stitching into the top 8 inches or so of this, where we had increased the size of the sleeve cap up there. I still need to match up the center of the sleeve cap with the shoulder seam and the underarm seam with the side seam of the bodice. I can then gather the rest of the sleeve down to fit into my arm side. And sometimes I do cheat when doing this, especially when I'm setting in a smooth cap sleeve and only do one line of gathering stitching in my sleeve cap. But don't do it. You're going to need to always use 2 lines of gathering stitching or more. Just save yourself the struggle, okay? There's a reason it's recommended. And I, of course, will set that in with the same 1/2 inch seam allowance over here on the machine. Same as it ever was, although it can be hard to see what I'm doing. I do have my hand kind of inside the garment, just making sure that nothing is getting folded or puckered as I'm stitching this into place. So you'll often, if you were to zoom out, if you were to watch over my shoulder, you would notice that I'm kind of wiggling the fabric with my left hand to make sure that everything is being stitched down together smooth. You have to make sure that what is under the presser foot is smooth. The rest doesn't matter, just what is going underneath the needle itself at any given time. And here is my 100 inch by 4 inch ruffle with its little lace edge. I'm actually going to press the seam allowance under, like so, just along the gathering stitching. And I will pin this into place, again distribute my gathers as evenly as possible, pin this ruffle where I want it, and I will again hand stitch this down into place. If I had made the yoke in a slightly different arrangement, I could have sandwiched this ruffle in between the yoke and the bodice, but because of the angle I wanted for the yoke, this is actually going to be pinned along the yoke seam and then up over the shoulder on either side so that this ruffle is right at the shoulder tip, covers the very top of the puff of my sleeve, and kind of like flares out over the top of my sleeve cap basically. Which again, a detail often included in 1890s dresses as well, so it's no wonder it was included on this. Very, very late Victorian inspired dress from Gunne Sax. And you can almost see what I'm up to pinning this behind my darn head, which I've clearly leaned right into shot. But after I have the edge of the ruffle pinned along the front yoke, I am arcing this carefully right along the sleeve cap, right over the shoulder seam until I meet up with the back yoke again, and then I will follow along with that to the center back where the zipper opening is. And should I probably have finished this raw edge that's on the underside of the ruffle here in some way? Yes. Would that have added a lot of bulk? Also yes, maybe I could have serged it, but hand stitching this into place will be my second to last step for this dress. And the last step of all is going to be setting in my lining. So here are the bodice pieces, sans yokes, that I have seamed together in the plain voile. I'm going to clip my curves and corners and press the seam allowance to the inside on this piece, basically finish off the lining with the iron. Then I will pin it into place where I want it on top of the seam allowance, covering up all the nastiness on the inside of the bodice itself. And then I'm going to hand stitch the lining in place along the inside of the bodice. Just sit for an hour or so, or however long it took. I didn't time it. It was at least 1 or 2 episodes of Dear Hank and John, for those of you who are also nerd fighters like I am. So, you know, put on a podcast, put on your audiobook, and get to stitching if you're ever going to do a lining this way. It takes a while, especially around these arm sides like this. But it does provide a very clean finish on the inside. You've heard of bag lining. This is basically the opposite of that. I've done bag lining. I've done flat lining. I don't know what this would count as, honestly. Maybe this style of lining has a name. Couldn't tell you. Maybe someone in the comments knows. But I sadly do not. Because I never had like a couture finishing class or anything like that. I would have loved to have taken such a thing. In the fashion university system, they call that interning somewhere fancy, if you can afford to do so. They don't seem to realize that not everyone can afford to move to New York or Paris for 6 months when you're doing an unpaid internship. That's one of those unfair things about fashion school. But studying fashion in any official capacity is always a strange thing. But once I have my lining all prepped, I've turned my dress inside out here. The dress is otherwise finished, perfectly wearable, but I wanted to add this lining into the mid section of the bodice again to cover up that raw edge seam allowance that is still sitting in here, and also to add a layer of modesty to the mid section of the whole dress. I will, however, wear this with a skirt slip or a full dress slip underneath it as well. But that's just me. You can leave things as sheer as you'd like, of course. But I'm just pinning this along and over all of the seam allowance, and I will fell it down into place invisibly along the inside of the dress. And once again, at this point, I was receiving quite a bit of additional feline assistance, though sadly, despite the fact that Oliver has needles for feet, he has not learned how to do any hand stitching. However, as my shoulders could tell you, he is quite adept at acupuncture. Here is my finished black cotton eyelet Gunne Sax inspired dress. And yes, this is on the edge of between a midi dress and a maxi length dress. Unfortunately, mine came out a little long. I would like to have made the A-line skirt portion a bit shorter, and I have already shortened my pattern by 2 inches because I would love to make this again in the future, perhaps even in white, although then I would, of course, style it with all black accessories to darken things up a bit. Overall, this dress really surprised me. I'm not usually a lover of ruffles, and yet there's just something about the overabundance of black that transforms everything in my mind, and I suddenly fall in love. In any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching, and an additional huge thank you to my patrons who make all of my work and these videos possible. And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, crafting, and decorating real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye! And after such a full video, I want to say an additional thank you to my patrons, especially my conservator patrons, Alicia, AM Person, Amy, Ashanti, Audra, Bethany, Kat, Catherine, Concetta, Karina, Denise, Diana, Elizabeth, Ellen, Elona, Eloquent Silence, Eric, Fatal But Not Serious, Franzi, Haley, Hesufina, Jambonium, Janet, Jenny, Lainey, Laura, Lynn H, Lynn O, Mac, Maggie, Marie, Megan, Melody, Myrna, Michelle, Mo, Natalie, Nina, Paula, Rachamus, Sarah, Sarah B, Sarah F, Sean, Sheeta, Stephanie, Susie, Isabel, Thea, and Ula. So many of you over on Patreon have supported me and stuck with me, been patient with me for such a long time now, and I cannot tell you how much it means to me. I could not continue to do what I do to make these videos without your support, so thank you.